Well, the wonderful book review today is Hello Girls by Elizabeth Cobbs, and so we're really looking forward to that review. And Jane Hansen is our speaker today, and you know Jane well. She's been here many times and is always willing to say to us, well, I'll be glad to review a book. This year we're lucky to have her twice. And Jane's background, as you know, is she's taught 25 years now at San Antonio College. She teaches English, and she's also been a very good friend of our church, and she loves to read. So we really welcome Jane today, and I look forward to our discussion. Jane Hansen, please.
Thank you so much. I sure love this book. It's a little bit more academic than some of the novels that we've been reading, but I don't think that Cobbs spends too much time on any part of the history, and all of it's really important. And I didn't realize how important this particular slice of history is until I really got into the book. Because I was a little girl during the 1970s, and yes, I was very aware of the women's movement, but I did not realize a few things as completely as Cobbs reflects them for us. And so my eyeballs kind of popped open in a few places when it indicated that women were not fully equal citizens until the 1970s. I think that really blew my mind because I thought we were ahead. We were, moving forward in a very important and exemplary way. And what this book really reminds us of is that we were behind, and we may still be behind. I wondered why, when I was little, people told me the things that I could grow up to be included mother, nurse, secretary, teacher, telephone operator. And I did not realize that left a lot of things out. Partly because my parents were very enthusiastic about me becoming a teacher. Both of them respected the professional category very much, and so I didn't think it was weird, but I also had a very forward grandmother, and she was born in 1898. She had one child. She was a nutritionist, a school cafeteria manager, and a real estate investor, which I thought was normal. My grandmother was a bit of a hippie. She was a Christian Scientist, but her attitude was, whatever you choose in your faith and your denomination, you don't visit that on your children until they're ready. So my mom went to all the different churches in the neighborhood, and then when she got a little older, decided she really liked the Methodist Church. And my grandmother just didn't have a problem with that because she thought that any sort of spiritual training was very important. But my grandmother would get a headache, and she'd sit down at her desk and meditate, which I thought, wow, I don't know why, but my grandma must be a hippie. But to the contrary, she really believed that if you could refocus your energy and let go of what was bothering you, you could let go of the tension of a headache. And so she was wicked in a lot of other wonderful ways, too. When my mom gave me a hard time about my math grade in 4th grade, I flunked. Because I thought it was dumb to draw clocks all the time. I wanted to do something else. So my mom gave me a hard time, and then her mom, come with me. And she pulled out a stack of my mother's grade cards from her own childhood and said very quietly, do not tell her I did this. But the apple does not fall far from the tree. I felt much better, and I did learn to love math later on, even though I thought drawing clocks in 4th grade was kind of dumb. But when you're the youngest, you learn everything everybody else knows very quickly because they expect you to step up. At least my dad and brothers and mom and grandparents did. And so I read quickly and often, to my mother's chagrin, as I was helping cook with a book in my hand. Nonetheless, my grandmother modestly deployed all of her interests on behalf of her family and community, and I guess that's where part of it comes from. I just could go on and on about this book. I only marked a little because I thought, well, that's maybe too much. And I don't want to give it all away. As with my past reviews, I'm just going to kind of cherry pick for you. But Elizabeth Cobbs is an excellent writer. She is a professor currently at Texas A&M, and she holds the Melbourne Glasscock Endowed Chair in American History there. She's also a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute. And her website, all of her other pursuits are really sort of inside of this area of expertise. She's also produced a documentary film on the Hello Girls, and you can see clips of that online as well. It's very impressive. Her work across her books, including textbooks, articles, etc., is really solid and extraordinary. And so in every aspect of her creative and professional life, she is a quite amazing writer. And so, as I was saying earlier, I was unaware of what women were not allowed to do completely until the 1970s. And I was surprised, I guess, because I had a family that just didn't really believe that women were limited much. Cobbs writes in her chapter, America's Last Citizens. In the United States, voting, fighting, and citizenship were braided together in the country's origins. Popular sovereignty spread when propertyless Revolutionary War veterans demanded the vote. They had earned the franchise by aiming their muskets and risking their lives for the Republic's defense. In the words of a toast raised in 1783 to celebrate triumph over Britain, may all our citizens be soldiers and all our soldiers citizens. Women were thus a lesser class of Americans. They couldn't be soldiers, and by law, they were an extension of their husbands and fathers. Married women had no legal identity separate from their male protectors. Even their nationality was not their own. They inherited their fathers at birth and acquired their husbands upon marriage. And up through the 1950s, American-born brides risked their citizenship if they wed a foreigner. Some were declared aliens against their wishes. That really blew my mind. And so to look at the limitations on women owning property and whatnot, I was surprised because, as I've said, my grandmother lived in Cleveland, Ohio, but because her sister-in-law lived here in San Antonio, she owned some duplexes on Woodlawn, right by St. Mary's, and she had a very steady income from those rental properties, and that for a female was quite unheard of. But I thought she was amazing and terrific, and you know, when you kind of love your grandmother that way, you just believe women can do anything because that model is so present in front of you. And she could do everything. She could sew, she could plant a garden. I mean, we did all kinds of things together that I'm not sure were strictly traditional. And this book is a solid reminder that women's rights were constricted in our country much longer than in other similar countries, and maybe why there seems to be a growing constriction today. Apparently, women have too much grit. We're too capable. And Cobb's retelling of this story deals with those conflicts and contradictions of female ability, commitment, and passion for work. And, you know, this has certainly enhanced my awareness. I've done some additional reading because I just felt like I had left something out of my own education. So as you look at Cobbs's list of books and article publications, you're going to find that she's quoted in a lot of different places. NPR did a review of this book as well that you can access, I think, by just looking at their podcasts. But she provides a story of the American women who joined the Signal Corps during World War II and provided telecommunication services from military leadership to the front in France once the U.S. engaged with other conflicts in World War I. And that was pretty surprising, too. This text, again, is far more academic than the Hamilton novel, but it is built on the primary documents that these women wrote. So Their diaries and their letters are central to this history, as well as recorded history and material from Pershing and other military officers to really show us how the men develop in their attitudes toward women, and especially Woodrow Wilson. This book is also written in the same sort of narrative voice. It's very frank, detailed, and observant. She wants us to think and rethink what we know about the first recognized U.S. female veterans and the wherewithal that it took for them to receive the recognition they justly earned. And so 60 years of consistently petitioning Congress to be recognized as veterans. And that's a lot of writing in a time when people actually used pen and paper and, envelopes and stamps. And so that's a lot of commitment as well. That's a time-consuming pursuit. I loved this sort of linking to Blackjack Pershing. He's one of those characters in American history that we all probably study a little bit, but we don't recognize that he is really instrumental in firing up the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So when he decides that he needs people to provide switchboard operation, he does not realize that men are not as fast at it as women are. And so when he recognizes that women can do 5 times as much connection in the same amount of time that men can, then he's convinced we need women helping us with telecommunications. And so these switchboard operators connected over 150,000 calls on their busiest days per day, serving the French front. That's a lot of phone calls. Our little cell phones would just blow up. So this book is built on facts, letters, diaries, also the actions and inactions of the U.S. War Department. And Cobbs's thesis is very matter-of-fact, predictive of the valiant effort that these women exerted. She writes, stubborn pride, bureaucratic arrogance, and the belief that women simply did not merit recompense blinded senior staff officers to faceless female veterans. And so she doesn't mince any words, but she's not mean. She's very matter-of-fact and very direct. So we read excerpts from the letters and diaries of Bertha Hunt, Merle Egan, Grace Banker, and several others, which illustrate the soldier's perspective, getting into the fray, longing for home, becoming all too familiar with the horrors of war, what you can and cannot write in a letter, what the censors are going to mark out, why waste your pen. So this book is very detailed in that regard, and you learn a good bit about these women's personal lives, which is fascinating as well. The book also goes into the battles and offensives that the women are the women are responsible for the advances and positive outcomes, if there can be such a thing in war. Their precision and constancy in providing telecommunications is unheard of, really. And so they assist in the incursions, and they are able to move the Allied forces forward. She also spotlights how this military service not only ignites the suffrage movement, but it instigates powerful men's perspectives to change. And again, particularly that of the president. Cobbs's prose invites you in at every turn. And, you can take a look at her. Unlike an academic book, this also has an index, but the academic side is all notes. And so you can see exactly where she pulls information from, just in case somebody says, that's fake news. It's not. It's absolutely documented, and that makes it even richer. The prologue of this text will really grab your attention, and the book will then sustain it, even when the descriptions of battles and bureaucracy might get on your nerves a little bit. Also really appreciated the photographs that are included. It always makes it easier to keep a person in mind. You've seen their face. You might think you know a little bit about their demeanor and who they really are. And these photographs from the early teens are really quite beautiful. even though maybe they're not as technologically advanced as what we can do today. 7 touring cars, roadsters, and Model T Fords constituted almost a traffic jam at the partially paved capital of windswept Montana in 1919. A local hero was coming home. The wide western sky was still luminous that June evening when midsummer's light bathed the town well past 9 o'clock, and crickets took up their nightly chorus late. Some in the party that wheeled jauntily up to the train station were veterans who had been discharged months earlier, conspicuous with their colorful victory medals. The men drew up into an honor guard and saluted as the tall, dark-eyed woman stepped from the train in her blue Army uniform after crossing 5,000 miles of ocean, forest, and prairie. 31-year-old Merle Egan was a big towner and one of the best long-distance telephone operators in the United States even before she had sailed to France. Now she was a local celebrity with her fitted suit, brass insignia, tan parade gloves, and cocky aviation cap. Merle smiled and waved, drained from her long ordeal, but happy to spy the eager crowd and the copper dome of the state capitol. It meant she was home. Montanans adored their girl, a soldier of unique distinction, and one of few women who was in the military service of the United States. Many patriotic Americans had done their bit to win the Great War, but Merle Egan's bit was especially remarkable. She and 200 other women had braved shot, shell, and submarines to operate the Army's vital communication system overseas. General John Pershing recruited them personally, and after the armistice, Merle commanded the switchboard for the epic peace conference at Versailles. What wasn't clear as she shook hands with friends and admirers was where Merle Egan and other American women were going next. So much had changed in barely a year. The war had made women into soldiers and America into a world power. It had given the vote to women in Europe and then the United States. Only the week before, the U.S. Senate had approved the Susan B. Anthony Amendment after an exhausting 70-year fight. So you just don't remember that. At least I didn't, that it took so much time and energy to actually prove that women are fit and equal. Merle would soon discover to her great surprise that the Army denied she'd ever been a soldier. This is not what officials promised when they first went looking for women to run the telephones the American generals needed in order to command every advance or retreat. And Merle Egan was a woman who believed in promises. Little did she know that evening in Helena that the next leg of her journey from Army switchboard operator to women's rights organizer would take 60 years. And so that's stick-to-itiveness, 60 years, that's something. And she has a family and does all of the normal traditional stuff on the side as well. So she must have really been juggling. By way of explaining the title, America's first female soldiers had been stationed throughout the shell-shocked France as part of a compact branch of the U.S. Army known as the Signal Corps. The Signal Corps did not fire cannons, sink submarines, or bayonet invaders. Their job was to send messages. In March 1918, Stars and Stripes hailed the women who arrived during Germany's bombardment of Paris as bilingual wire experts. They called them Uncle Sam's Hello Girls. And so, like their counterparts, American nurses, that service was not necessarily recognized until there was a great deal of documentation and demonstration presented. So I found that part extraordinarily interesting, and this comment as well. After President Woodrow Wilson endorsed both causes, the war and women's suffrage, he told the U.S. Senate that the popular vote was vital to the realization of the objects for which the war is being fought. So at some point, he finally decides that this is part of the freedom that the soldiers are actually fighting for. These women's efforts steadily wore down long-held beliefs about women, their delicacy and weak constitutions, which is kind of surprising when so many of these women come from farms and ranches. And if you grew up farming or ranching, even if you just did it for the summer with your relatives, that is not easy work, let alone, scrubbing houses. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you can live on a farm or a ranch without working hard. It's just not something that happens, and everybody has a job, and they're equally challenging. The documentary of the same name, one critic notes that Pershing's order implied military service without stating it, the U.S. government recoiling from the order's precision until 1977, when President Jimmy Carter signed the order granting the few remaining Hello Girls veteran status, and hence they were buried with full military honors. The critic goes on to note, it's an abiding irony of American military history that one poorly communicated order kept the very soldiers tasked with communicating orders from receiving, for 60 years, the recognition they earned and deserved. So, as a wonderful history lesson for us, and I guess also when you're a young kid studying history, you don't really study everything because it might be a little too disturbing. But honestly, I don't even remember going into this in my college history classes. It wasn't until I took a class in women's writing and in the women's movement that I actually read more about who these ladies actually were and what they put up with in order to help us earn the vote. So, Alice Paul suffering, being force-fed, because she wasn't going to eat until Wilson let go of his hold on women's suffrage. And I can't even imagine, if you just try to feed a baby that doesn't want to be fed, that's a pretty tough battle. But to force open an adult woman's mouth and pour nutrition down her throat without her consent sounds pretty much like torture to me. But they didn't think it was a big deal. Merle Egan's full adventure spanned nearly 100 years. The day she met with a newspaper reporter in August 1979, age 91, she wore the earrings explicitly forbidden when she served with the Signal Corps during the Great War. At that time, Army rules prohibited any jewelry other than rings while in uniform, which meant no accessories except in one's quarters. It was the only place a uniform was not required. Even there, soldiers might wear civilian clothing only when not receiving visitors, so there was really no point to earrings. Aluminum dog tags on a string were the closest thing to personal decoration. Merle told the reporter she didn't care if the Army gave her a proper ceremony, that she didn't care if the Army gave her a proper ceremony. She really did. She fought too hard, too long, and once leery of modern feminism, she now championed the National Organization for Women, who in turn championed her. They were clip-on earrings, the sort her generation preferred. Merle wore them whenever she had her picture taken, such as when she spoke to elementary schools near the retirement home, telling the forgotten story to eager upturned faces and showing them the doll with the smart blue uniform she had sewn. She attached the buttons from her own jacket and the metal insignia from the collar, a torch of gold between crossed wigwag flags above the initials U.S. Compelled by Congress, the U.S. Army was at last ready to recognize her service, but was she ready for them? Why hadn't she accepted any of the Army's invitation to go to Washington, D.C.? Perhaps she was still too mad at those who dared forget her colleague and peer Grace Spanker. And so, Merle is really compelling because she seems to be one of the longest-lived Hello Girls. I just thought it might be easier to follow her a little bit through the story. But there are many women in this story that are worthy of following, and they're fascinating, each and every one. And the fact that they kept their regalia, or they kept their documentation, when Merle Egan organizes this fight to get the Congress to recognize them, the documents aren't just paper documents that are the most convincing. It's actually Grace Spanker's uniform. And so the uniform decorated very similarly to men's And so how can Congress say that women did not serve in the military when their very uniform declares the very same statuses that men's uniforms do? So, you know, they weren't thinking real clearly, and maybe that's a good thing. Perhaps because we did not bear witness to these times in which the Hello Girls were young women, it might be difficult to believe that these gritty women understood their personal capabilities. But Cobb tells us that Merle Egan is really special all along. Merle Egan helped relay the first transcontinental calls that took place while the war blazed in Europe. I was fortunate enough to listen in on the first conversation from Washington, D.C. to the West Coast, she told a later AT&T chairman. Merle then worked for Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph. Born on a Kansas farm, she grew up in the coal mining camps of southern Colorado, where her father was superintendent of mines until fired for his rabble-rousing and fiery Irish oratory. Talk about apples not falling far from the tree. At the time, fewer than 15% of young Americans graduated high school, and Merle was no exception. She completed 3 years before economic circumstance sent her to work, first as a relief operator, then as a toll operator in the PBX Exchange of Denver's proudest hotel, the ornate Brown Palace. From that July day in 1906, when I became an operator in Denver, I was fascinated by the fact that people could communicate through the cords I handled, she wrote. It was like holding lives in her palm. When opportunity arose in Montana to join a public system, Merle jumped at the chance. She proved so resourceful that the company sent her from town to town to straighten out trouble. By the time World War I began, Egan was a traffic supervisor with 11 years' experience. She was also 29, unmarried, and being courted at a slow pace by a man in no hurry to make plans. What a lovely phrase. Merle Egan was a fit, well-proportioned 165 pounds, taller and bigger than many men. It must have been hard to be 5'11" in an era when the average male topped out at 5'6". One 1918 photograph shows a dark-eyed young woman with a wary smile, tilted chin, and skeptical, intelligent expression. Her employer described her as industrious, level-headed, even-tempered, and cautious, with instinctive tact in difficult situations. Her individuality has made her a natural leader, he reported to the Army. Her loyalty is unquestioned. Merle Egan was just the sort of person to show her grit in a patriotic cause or any other campaign about which she cared, and she wasn't alone. Thousands of women felt exactly the same. So that's kind of an interesting observation. I met one of the very first women pilots, and she said virtually the same thing. It's very interesting, and talk about level-headed and charming to boot. Merle Egan found similar switchboards the next year when she arrived in Tours, France, delighted to discover that General Roussel had snagged the same type of equipment used in the large telephone offices at home. By then, the Army had decided it must also have the best personnel to go along with the best equipment. The Army had also not planned to induct women. In fact, it was far behind other armed services in this regard. The U.S. Navy had steamed ahead abreast of the British War Department. Anticipating war, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniel realized early in 1917 that he did not already have enough sailors for his ships being built under the Naval Act that President Wilson had nursed through Congress when trying to defend neutrality. If fighting commenced, the shortage would worsen. One solution was to find a new source of labor for clerical tasks so that men could go to sea. Since ships defined navies, Daniels may have thought females could fill landlubber jobs without wounding the Navy's pride. Daniels asked his legal counsel, "Is there any regulation which specifies that a Navy yeoman be a man?" When advised that no statute prohibited females, Daniels sent out the order: "Enroll women in naval service as yeomen, and we will have the best clerical assistance the country can provide." More than a third of the nation's office personnel at that time were then female. Despite some skepticism, the Navy obeyed its civilian secretary, and on March 17, 1917, the United States became the first modern nation to enlist females. Isn't that awesome? Daniels grew up with a bone-deep understanding of the risks of nonconformity. An amalgam of contradictory impulses, he led a campaign for white supremacy at the turn of the century that disenfranchised blacks in North Carolina. And 2 decades later, he opposed the Ku Klux Klan as overbearing and violent. But on women's rights, or at least the rights of white women, he was more consistent. His widowed mother had raised him, and as a newspaperman, he had publicly supported female suffrage for decades and married an independent, high-spirited woman who supported suffrage too. The Secretary of the Navy was determined to treat his new recruits with respect. So the training then is certainly different than what women were used to at the time, but they are also battling sort of propaganda where women are illustrated as pitiful, in need of rescue, or aproned mothers skimping on bread to save food for soldiers. And while that might be true, I don't know about that pitiful business. Even petite women are pretty tough. You know, we in the South, women are called steel magnolias. So, you know, there's got to be some backbone in there. One of the Navy's most memorable recruitment posters featured a short-haired, flirty woman in a sailor suit saying, "Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy." Some versions of the poster included the tagline, "Be a man and do it." But the poster went beyond shaming male slackers, depicting uniformed women as especially attractive and patriotic. It undoubtedly encouraged some females to enlist. And so female yeomen matched their strides to men. They marched the same way. They learned the same things, established new precedents for acceptable public behavior. After one group marched behind horses down Broad Street in Philadelphia past Independence Hall, their drill instructor gave them an explicit lesson in the gender-neutral conduct expected of sailors confronted with manure. You don't kick it, you don't jump over it, you step in it. So that's what happens when you're working too. You don't have time to pay attention to what you're stepping in, you just got to keep going. So the training emboldens women, and very influential men embolden women, and women are emboldened by their own experiences and by the passion of contributing to what the nation needs at the time. And so that's also a very interesting perspective. The beginning of the book, there's an epigraph, but it's the entire lyric of George M. Cohan's Over There. And I wish I had a nickel for every time my granddad whistled that. He was a doughboy, and we've got some great photographs of him. He never got shipped overseas. He joined late when he was supposed to, but he never had to leave stateside. And the point here is that these women sought to serve, and they kept talking about going over there. They didn't want to serve from the United States, and they were frustrated when they were assigned to the East Coast. They were chomping at the bit like any other soldier. And I guess I know that because my dad said, you know, once he joined in World War II, he just didn't want to stop and wait anymore. He just wanted to get on with it. And I guess that's really the sign of a soldier committed to serve. Let's go. Let's be about it. In terms of their qualifications, Cobbs tells us the Army wants women, and this ad was in the New Orleans Times-Picayune. The government would uniform and compensate them on the same basis as nurses. The Army calls telephone girls, the Kansas City Star informed townsfolk in December. Women phone operators for Army, Philadelphia Inquirer echoed. They have the same privileges and allowances as Army nurses. So even in that recruiting material, there's evidence that the intention was to make women soldiers. In the Duluth News-Tribune, Pershing forces to need hello girls and 20,000 nurses. The switchboard force would number 150 physically fit bilingual young ladies. They would be enlisted for the duration of the war, with the same quarters, rations, pay, and uniforms as nurses. So that sounds pretty much like soldiering, even though their role is a little bit different. Like male volunteers, females possessed a range of motivations, from a yearn for adventure to a desire to help family in the war to a hatred of German aggression. Many had ties to France and Belgium as strong as the ones they had to the United States. Multiple motivations are normal. Humans are complex creatures with shifting emotions and ideas, yet patriotism was the primary reason for most, according to their testimony. As one young woman described her emotions, Pershing's call had aroused in me a great unquenchable patriotic desire to do my bit. So even their vernacular sounds like the vernacular of men replying to these enlistment calls. And Cobb talks about how training further emboldens them. And so as they move to the East Coast, they take on a number of what might have been considered male perspectives or male behaviors. From wherever they traveled, the operators cohered as military units in Manhattan. There they met their chief operators, got fingerprinted and photographed for passports, heard lectures on hygiene, practiced drilling, and listened to talks by Signal Corps officers, including Captain Ernest Vesson. The Army issued them a list of items to purchase, from tan parade gloves, woolen stockings, sateen bloomers, and union suits to bicarbonate of soda, Lysol, iodine, and sewing kits. Uniform coats, skirts, blouses, hats, high-top shoes, and bronze insignia were the most expensive items. The entire kit cost between $250 and $350. AT&T loaned money to those who could not afford the cost, with regular installments deducted from their salaries. So generous. For many earning $60 a month, half a year's salary went into their kit. Some served barely long enough to earn $350, meaning they received virtually no compensation once the debt was repaid. Operators were told their status was similar to that of officers, so uniforms must be individually fitted. By contrast, yeomanettes received standard issue suits at no cost. So not only are they stepping up because they're passionate about the opportunity, but they have to pay for it too in cash. And when you think about, my mom was a school secretary during World War II, so she earned $60 a month. And that's 25 years later. So you want to try to think about how they can actually buy groceries if they get nothing in their salary and they can't pay their rent. If they're single people on their own, that's a pretty unique situation at that time. The women loved their uniforms, which meant full membership in the American Expeditionary Forces. And so every soldier must have a uniform, and the telephone operator units being part of the Army are no exception to this rule. Women in the garb of American Armed Services will have in their hands the wires that serve as the nerves of our Army in France. So it was really, everything really hinged on them being prepared and ready to serve and then following through. The book does go into pretty amazing detail about when the women are not actually in very safe areas. And it's the first time that women really go into battle as a part of the military. Now, if we study the American Revolutionary War, there are some females who just decided, I better get out there and help. Maybe you remember the legend of Molly Pitcher. And there are apparently several people who contribute to that legend, and they did, in fact, begin by carrying water to the soldiers, but then when the soldiers were injured, had to be moved off the field, somebody needed to start working with the cannon, the ladies stepped up, as we do. So I don't know that this is really a unique part of our history in that it appears to me that women have always done these stepping up kinds of things. But this is, in the modern period, the first major world war that is a chemical war and also a telecommunications war. And we thought watching Iraq all those years ago, the Gulf War immediately on CNN, whenever you wanted to, was pretty unique. But this is that instigating moment where eventually telecommunications will share what is going on overseas with us in real time, minute by minute. So it's a really interesting sort of connection to be able to make. See, it's really geeky for me. I'm doing both the academic thing and the literary thing at the same time. And so Cobbs, as a historian, has been winning awards since she was a very young girl. I think her first award at age 15. And she's not done, so I imagine there'll be some really amazing things that she continues to do. But to remind us at this time about the grit and the backbone of our female ancestors, I think is pretty amazing. And women have always been involved in wars. It's just that we document it very differently. My dad used to say, you know, it's just the winners that write it all down. So you have to go back and take a look at what people say personally about those periods of time. And those are kind of the best history classes when you read letters and diaries, and it dispels a lot of mythology about our forebears that, you know, that the Puritans were all very buttoned up. They weren't. They had lots of kids. and that, you know, that women did not involve themselves in controversies. Sure they did. Just through different means. But we don't really write that down. We don't share that with girls because we go through so many different periods of time where it's more important for women to be decorative and beautiful and make the household fabulously comfortable. And yet, if they're capable of all those things, what else indeed are they capable of, and vice versa? So maybe what Cobbs is saying to us is that we sometimes sell each other short, and that our history does the same thing. And it's a book like this that will really take you into that reality and provide something different to think about. You know, just if your grandmother or your mother was from that period, you want to think about how tough those ladies really are. I mean, they got us all here, and they got us moved ahead a little bit. And now, you know, we have to keep providing that same kind of energy for the folks that come after us. And I think that this kind of a voice, this would be a great book for an American history class to read on the side. This would be fantastic. And I can just imagine how the students would want to call the National Organization Women and say, okay, what can you tell us about these ladies? And, you know, some good research and some good back and forth discussion would go on. This whole book is going to help you ask a lot of questions. And I think it asks the same questions about war that any good book will ask. What are we doing there? Why did we wait? Why didn't we wait? All of those questions, the positive and the negative of them, are really posed in the text. And each female character that you meet is as interesting as Merle Egan. It's just there's so many of them, I didn't want to try to confuse you by just reeling off all of their names and trying to give you some kind of character sketch of each of them. During this same period of time, attitudes towards women in general in the world are changing. And you know, the Hello Girls as a document and witness to suffrage in America is an important document, I think, as well. But it also discusses the tenor of attitudes in Europe and the ways that women are perceived. It also talks about our regionalisms that might have been criticized or emphasized. But protocol is a tough problem for the officers. They don't quite know how to deal with these women. They can't really go drill sergeant on them because that might not be proper. And so the officers have a hard time. They have to do a lot of critical thinking to figure out how to treat women and how to improve conditions surrounding all their soldiers. The commanding officer said the members of this unit will, it is believed, perform their duties with greater efficiency should they keep their acquaintance among either commissioned or enlisted men at a minimum. He sternly warned that female operators should, as in civilian life, resent and properly report undue familiarity. All this was easier said than done, as the captain knew young men and women would take an interest in each other. A female occupation was merging with an all-male workforce, and Wesson was still tussling with Army lawyers whom he hoped would soon militarize the women. He wrote Estabrook that operators were under no obligation to render military courtesies to superior officers at the present time. But, he said, operators should demonstrate an attitude of respect towards superior officers and enlisted men in the proper performance of their duties. So he keeps his options open. Cobbs says, women were not yet part of the carefully regulated salute-swapping hierarchy, but he was training them for it. And he tacitly agreed that the women's status approached that of a West Point cadet. There is no occasion in the mind of the undersigned, Wesson wrote, when an enlisted man should have any right to address them. So they're supposed to live in silence and not pay attention to those cute young men over there. Ignore everything. I don't know if I could do that. I was not good at that when I was a young person. Easily distracted. In terms of the president and his conceptions of what suffrage might do to the United States, he eventually relents. And Cobb writes that he did not enfranchise half the adult population of the United States single-handedly. Most of the credit goes to those who campaigned generation after generation. But as Victoria Brown observes, the president underwent the most public and important male conversion to women's suffrage in U.S. history. The word conversion is noteworthy. The son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers, Wilson had married the daughter of yet another minister. He lived his life in an atmosphere of high-mindedness, and it is hard to imagine one of America's most ideological presidents promoting a permanent reform of which he did not approve. Women and international events had changed his perceptions. So there we go, ladies. Again, I think my favorite part of this book is that these women's voices kind of jump off the page. And it wasn't that I lost track, but I wanted to go back and read what Grace Banker said again and again, because she's so smart and so tough. It's hard to believe that she's brand new to everything in the military. And I think that's a kind of an interesting thing about the women in this book, that you might go into it thinking, well, I don't know, the first female veterans ever. And they're every bit as tough, rough and tumble as the men are, although I don't read about them getting into fistfights too often. Nonetheless, they're in situations that they don't grow up prepared for. And sometimes young men often have those conversations with their fathers and grandfathers about perhaps having to be a soldier. And so that these women wanted to dive in and completely commit themselves to the war effort is pretty extraordinary. It's not easy for them, especially getting from New York to Europe in submarine-infested waters, some of them not sleeping because they're so focused on what if. And if you know a little history of the time, there are plenty of ships that are blown to pieces in the middle of the Atlantic by the opposing forces. And so I imagine that was pretty nerve-wracking to try to remain calm. And, in terms of limited telecommunication, you wouldn't know automatically, right? We didn't know automatically about that iceberg that sank the Titanic. And so that kind of foreknowledge is still not really very much available. So there's some discussion of some of these ships that sink, ships that are brought back from the Philippines and refit so they can carry people back and forth across the Atlantic. Merle Egan took seriously the instruction, "You are in the Army and you must conduct yourself accordingly." This meant immaculate attire. When a fellow operator in Egan's unit lost a button, a superior officer immediately admonished her, "Police your uniform, soldier." Adele Hopcock wrote her sister Eleanor just before sailing, "A button off our suits would be a catastrophe." Care paid off. The uniform commanded respect. When Egan sailed out of New York Harbor gazing upon the Statue of Liberty one last time, she encountered a young aviator as she turned away from the ship's rail. He stared and then asked, "What are you doing on this ship in that uniform?" Egan looked him straight in the eye. She found her height an advantage when speaking with incredulous men. "Same reason you are," she replied. "I'm on my way to France to help win the war." Her answer satisfied him, and they struck up a friendly conversation that continued over the following week. Pilots encountered extraordinary risks, and the aviator, younger than Egan by several years, may have welcomed the expertise of Signal Corps operators. Danger made unusual expedients routine. Egan's commitment to the uniform that was her license to serve led her to endure black-laced boots so ill-fitting they caused injury. Egan's chief operator, Louise Barbour, was a stern taskmaster who had no use for whiners. Unwilling to request special favors, Egan stood through lifeboat drills and endured long marches to mess halls below multiple decks, wearing regulation shoes inadequate for her 5'11" frame. When she disembarked in Liverpool, her unit marched to the railway station. Once in Southampton on the other side of England, Barbour even acknowledged Egan's problem. An Army physician took one look at the swollen toe and prescribed cold steel. Removing a scalpel from his bag, he lanced it without anesthesia. When Egan calmly thanked him, he looked startled that she hadn't gone into girly hysterics, and Egan was delighted. She secretly felt like crying when the doctor said she could not continue with her unit. Physical pain troubled her less than the prospect of a travel delay. The infection was severe, the doctor said, and she would be assigned to a hospital tent for a week. When another physician later lectured her about her boots, Egan said, "Yes, sir, I agree they are wrong for me, but I am in the Army and must wear Army shoes." Egan got a better fitting pair when she rejoined her unit in France a week late. So even after healing, she put those boots back on and kept wearing them. I don't know about you, but I'm taking off mean shoes as soon as I know they're mean. So that to me is real stick-to-itiveness. I am miserable if my feet hurt. I'm just amazed by these women. They are tough. They are excitingly interesting, and they're representing the best that America had to offer at the time, which was technology. We had better technology, telecommunications, than anybody else. And the women that are responsible for their part in the Signal Corps know that position and that job better than anybody else. They're the best trained phone operators in the world at the time. And they're called the Hello Girls also because when they begin to answer these phone calls from the field and they say hello, the fella on the other side, delighted to hear English, "Hello, girl." And so apparently Pershing certainly influenced it, but to the delight of the American military, they were hearing female voices who spoke English on the other end of the line. Cobbs' book, in its intent, is a first-rate read. Her excellent retelling should have a continuing impact on readers, and for me, it's a book that I will read and reread, if only to connect to that idea that women's effort to become full-fledged citizens took far more effort than I really ever thought. If we observe those echoes for continuing effort for equality across our nation and for its citizens in this book, it's about grit and stick-to-itiveness, right? It's about veterans who happen to be women and their adventurous ways, and their 60-year battle. I don't know if I could do anything for 60 years except maybe get up in the morning and keep moving forward, but they did so much more, and it's really quite extraordinary. In the end, the National Organization of Women, Barry Goldwater, and a crusading attorney, Mark Huff, did the right thing by these women. And when you get to the Barry Goldwater part, if you've been recalling your history, he was considered to be a little bit of a right-winger and really tough. But the fact that he really bought into the idea that women, these women in particular, were completely capable. We charged them with a responsibility that they deployed brilliantly, and many of them were killed. And then further, they were disabled, so when they got home, when they were considered not to be veterans, they could not seek care through the Veterans Administration. So thanks, girls, you're on your own. And so Merle Egan really feels committed to the idea that I absolutely have to see this through. It doesn't matter how old I am. I'm going to continue to work through this, and it's not easy. I mean, you got all the rest of the book for that part of the story. Maybe I should come back another day. The final part in the epilogue is really quite amazing, and we're looking at the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. I've seen some of the battlefields in France. You can still find ordnance there. Farmers regularly will disc a field and will turn up ordnance. And so they're very careful in the ways that they farm, but they've also spent a good deal of money repairing the battlefields and the memorial sites for this 100th anniversary of the end of the war. And so something that starts with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, and a strong discussion of the 19th Amendment that is passed with the support of a Southern president and a good handful of segregationists, is extraordinary. That even with a very narrow scope and a history of that narrowness, at this point in time, this decision was appropriate to them. I think that's really interesting. And I would encourage you, if you have not read this book, to do so. It will inspire your perseverance. It will make you think amazing things about your female forebears. And it will tell you something about American history that maybe we don't study enough. But I would urge you to read this book. And I don't know if you have a musical ear, anytime they mention George M. Cohan, I'm going through the entire collection of his songs, and those were kind of the songs that my grandparents liked to listen to as well. So the nostalgia of it is fascinating, but the history is quite amazing. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you. But if you can read Elizabeth Cobbs, anything she's written, I would urge you to do so.